Hi all, it's Stubro here, back with another video, and this time on understanding how to drive your race car in the wet. In addition to that, I'm going to show you some of the setup tips for getting the most from your car in a wet race, and how to adapt your car to changing weather conditions during a race. So by the end of this video, you'll be confident in what you're doing, and be armed with the knowledge required to master the wet track. So stick with me to the end of the video to find out a few small tricks I haven't seen on any other videos on YouTube. So if the recent Spa 24-hour special event taught us anything, it's that the introduction of wet weather to iRacing is actually a good thing, in my opinion anyway. It turned Spa from a sprint race into a war of attrition, with weather being the great leveler. It also showed us that in the future we're going to need to be able to handle the dynamic weather system and learn how to adapt both the car and our driving to suit the changing weather conditions. But to do that, we need to understand a few things first. So let's get into understanding the wet line. Racing in the rain is an excellent way to develop smooth and precise inputs with the steering wheel, brakes, and throttle, because the repercussions of upsetting the car's tenuous grip are greatly magnified on a wet surface. The funny thing is, the smooth and precise driving techniques required in the rain just so happen to translate to faster laps in the dry too, since the principles of conservation of momentum and minimizing weight transfer apply just as much in the dry as they do in the rain. In the rain, however, a tyre will reach its traction peak much earlier than in the dry, and it will also level off more quickly and drop off more suddenly as slip angle increases. This means less time to react to a loss of traction, and if you don't react quickly enough, things can go from bad to worse in a hurry. Whether you're conscious of it or not, you're probably using a slip angle of 6 to 10 degrees in the dry, generally considered ideal in terms of generating maximum grip from the tyres, but in the wet, the optimal slip angle is more in the range of 3 to 6 degrees. Understanding how your tyres operate in the rain is the first step to maximising speed, while averting the unscheduled trip across the infield. But there are lots of other factors that will help you find the fastest way around a wet circuit. One of the first things you'll learn when racing in the rain is that the dry line is likely not the fastest or grippiest line in the wet. That's because the dry line tends to have a lot of rubber laid down on it, and this rubber layer can be slick when wet. The dry line can also be polished smooth over time, whereas the less used part of the pavement tends to be more abrasive and porous, making for better grip in the wet. It's also important to be aware of the fact that paint and concrete tend to have a lot less grip when wet, because these surfaces are obviously less porous, so it's best to avoid concrete patches or painted lines or curbs. Every track is different in the rain because of the age and condition of its asphalt varies, and drainage tends to differ too. So it always takes some experimentation to find the grippiest or fastest line around a circuit in the wet, but as a general rule, it's best to shorten the turns and lengthen the straights by going deeper, making a sharper but slower turn, and then using a very late apex. And since water runs downhill, if a corner is banked, you'll probably find more grip or less water up high in the turn. The point being, use your eyes and your head and you'll find the driest, grippiest parts of the track when using the racing line in the rain. In terms of big no-nos, trail braking in the rain is one of them. In the rain, it's always best to brake, turn, and accelerate in a deliberate and separate fashion. If you combine any of these, the result often includes a backwards trip through the weeds. In the wet, braking isn't nearly as compromised as acceleration. This means the driver will find himself struggling more with controlling wheel spin coming out of corners than fighting brake lockup. It's also important to be conscious of the fact that lateral grip, cornering, is reduced more in the rain than longitudinal grip, braking and acceleration. So even though you may feel like there's great grip under braking, don't be fooled into thinking the same amount of grip will be available in the turns or when jumping on the accelerator. So there's lots of videos on YouTube about applying these techniques, and I'm not going to go into that here, but let's summarize what we've spoken about thus far. In the wet, water will sit on top of the rubbered up sections of the track. Typically, this will impact the braking zone entering a corner. It is obvious to say that braking zones are extended in the wet, but you need to understand why, and this is a contributing factor. Due to this fact, most of the grip in the wet is found offline, so consider this when you're braking. Braking off the main racing line and moving back onto it in preparation for corner entry is generally going to provide more grip. Run deeper into the corner and turn backwards towards the apex to optimize your grip levels. This doesn't hold true on green tracks, so a track with low usage, as the rubber hasn't had time to build up before the rain. So if the track is relatively green and the rain mild to moderate, you can still use the racing line, but be aware to monitor the changing state of the track line. This is particularly the case if you're in a race that transitions from dry to wet racing. Equally, you need to really focus on doing one thing at a time. What do I mean by that? Well, trail braking in the wet is a big no-no. You want to brake, and in most situations, pass the regular turn-in point you have for a corner and turn back into the apex. With more grip found off the racing line, you'll simply find more grip. This also carries for the doing one thing at a time, as you will be completely off the brakes at turn-in point, enabling the tyre to use all its grip to get the car turned, rather than sharing the grip attempting to slow the car down. Smooth inputs are also critical to getting the most out of yourself when driving in the wet. Slow down your steering inputs, as rapid direction changes are likely to lead to understeering, which is amplified in the wet. Equally, with the brake and throttle inputs, slow progression is key to getting the most from these inputs without inducing a slide or wheel spin. Similarly, in the dry, you may be accustomed to short, quick applications of the throttle to adjust a car's attitude in turns, and then jumping on the gas aggressively once you've got the car more or less pointed in the right direction for the next straight. In the wet, a subtler technique is required, where only smooth and gradual applications of the go pedal will avoid wheel spin and speed robbing understeer. So what to change if it starts raining during the race? There's lots of tools you can use to help make your car more compliant during a race. These are the early changes to make, particularly for races subject to light rain rather than a heavy downpour, where there's sitting water on the track. As progressive changes, these can help to manage the race until the rain gets heavy enough or the track conditions worsen prior to putting on full wet tyres. However, there are also great tools to use when the rain is constant, in addition to car changes made during a pit stop, which we'll cover shortly. You'll always need to consider the duration of the rain. A short, sharp shower may not require a full change of setup. You may only need to run a wet tyre or be able to continue to run as is if the track isn't considered fully wet. So what changes are available in car? First and foremost, you need to utilise traction control and ABS where fitted as best you can. On a GT3, for example, you can increase both settings to 10, or while in dry races, inducing these assists slows your time significantly. In the wet, they are more of a saving grace. Traction control can help you avoid a spin and even flare-ups from touching puddles at full throttle. But it's important to understand the traction control settings on your particular vehicle. In our test car, the Ferrari 296 GT3, the position of the traction control switch determines how aggressively the ECU cuts engine torque in reaction to rear wheel spin. 12 settings are available, with position 2 providing the least intervention and position 12 providing the most. Like the ABS setting, position 1 will disable the traction control system altogether. More intervention will result in less wheel spin and less rear tyre wear, but can reduce overall performance if the traction control is cutting engine torque too aggressively and stunting corner exit acceleration. Making changes to your ABS settings and brake balance can also make a huge improvement in relative wet weather performance. It is critical that you know how your in-car adjustments work for your particular vehicle. While adjustments are similar in most vehicles, how the car applies the settings can vary. This information can be obtained from the iRacing user manual for your particular car, and I've put a link to those in the description. For example, in the Ferrari 296 GT3, the ABS system features 12 positions divided into 3 groups to suit varying track conditions. Lower values provide less assistance, and higher values provide more assistance to prevent brake lockup. Settings 2 to 7 are for slick tyres in the dry, and 8 to 12 are for wet conditions only. Generally, setting 8 will be good for light rain, while settings will need to be increased as conditions worsen, with setting 12 being for heavy rain. Setting 1 disables the system completely. It's also a good thing to note that your dash, particularly in the Ferrari, but across a majority of the GT3s, will let you in on secrets about what's happening with the car. For example, in the Ferrari, 2 LED lights on either side of the display will illuminate in the event of a wheel lockup, their location indicating which wheel is locking. The upper magenta lights will illuminate when the front wheels are locked, and 2 cyan lights indicate lockups on the rear wheels. These lights also flash where traction control is engaged. As another example, and to demonstrate the difference between two GT3 cars, in the BMW GT3, settings 1 to 6 are for slick tyres in dry conditions, and 7 to 11 are for wet conditions. Generally, setting 7 will be good for light rain, while settings will need to be increased as conditions worsen, with setting 11 being for heavy rain. In this case, setting 12 disables the system completely. It's certainly worthwhile looking through the iRacing user manual for any car you regularly drive that has these aids, to ensure you know where to adjust the car to for particular conditions you face. I've seen a number of drivers just ramp it up to the maximum value without realising it disables the system completely and causing them too much trouble in the wet and ultimately ending in a spin. Equally, drivers dial it back to 6 when the track is still wet, assuming that it's the medium setting, when in reality it's a dry track setting. Again, I've put a link in the description to the iRacing user manuals, and if you aren't sure about where your car should be, I suggest you have a look at them. Last but not least, don't forget your brake bias. In wet or slippery conditions, you may want to adjust the brake bias more towards the rear, as there is less forward weight transfer in the car due to low traction limits. Keep an eye and ear on how the car behaves, and use the in-car dash to see if you are constantly locking front wheels but not the rear. Gradually roll your brake bias rearward to ask less of the front tyres and to balance the car out. Where fitted, you can also keep an eye on the in-car brake temperatures by rotating the screen on your dash, just to make sure that those brake temperatures are getting into the window required to get optimal performance from your brakes. So let's have a look now at changes that you can make during a pit stop. First and foremost, one that I wasn't too sure about and couldn't find any information on but have tested is tyre pressures. Even wet tyres have an optimal pressure to maximise grip, so don't overlook this. You'll need to do some testing and understand where the optimal pressure is to not overinflate the tyre, causing crowning and reducing grip. You also don't want to underinflate the tyre. I did some back-to-back testing in the Ferrari 296, and along with other changes below, it made a big difference to how the car performed. I couldn't find any information from iRacing in the release notes to suggest that the pressures made much of a difference to how the tyres performed. However, in testing, the car is far more responsive when reaching the 178 to 181 kPa window, which it struggled to do on cold track temperatures when starting at 165 kPa. So through my testing, my recommendation here is to start wet tyres a little higher on pressure. I started them at 171 kPa with a track temp of 20 and monitored it through the stint, but they quickly got up to optimal pressure. The great thing about it is you can obviously adjust them for the conditions that are coming, and unless the track totally dries out, which is unlikely to change that significantly during your stint or race, you can drop the pressure back or ultimately probably switch back to dry tyres during the race. You want to soften the car as much as possible. Now, it isn't a coincidence that iRacing has introduced roll bar and wing adjustments that can be made during a pit stop. There is a time penalty for these, but the penalty isn't as significant as not making the change. Again, you'll want to test how these changes impact your chosen car and find that sweet spot that you like. But as a general rule, where your car is equipped with a wing, you'll want to set it to the maximum downforce setting. As I mentioned before, the grip in the tyre is something that you need to generate through both mechanical and aero grip. By increasing grip through the rear wing, your high-speed stability and your ability to work the rear tyre is improved. More rear aero grip also helps during braking and to keep the car from spinning. In the way you change your driving on a wet track, with lower cornering speeds, weight transfer is significantly reduced. As such, body roll is also reduced. The sway bar or roll bar doesn't need to work as hard to balance the load on the tyre or to resist the roll that is introduced when you corner. So changing front roll bar stiffness should improve corner traction, and if it's really raining, I go full soft on the front bar and disconnect the rear bar to maximise roll and weight transfer from the reduced grip. So now we're going to talk about other setup considerations. First and foremost, let's have a chat about brake pads. The friction material you use in the car impacts the effectiveness of the pad. It also requires more work to bring the pad into operating temperature. The low setting provides the least friction, reducing the effectiveness of the brake, while the medium and high provide more friction and increase the effectiveness of the brake while increasing the risk of a brake lockup. So consider which pad material you are running, particularly if you know the race will be wet. Running the medium to high could prove a more dangerous option with the increased risk of brake locking, but if you're driving a car equipped with ABS, this may not deter you. I also tested the compounds and optimum temperatures, and particularly on cool days where teams may block brake ducting in real life, the brake temps hardly reached the required temperatures unless heavy braking was involved. Particularly with rear temps, this was a factor. Brake bias change helps to work the rear, but obviously this has the opposite impact on the front. So play around to achieve the best results for your driving style while maintaining consideration for the impact on grip. In the event that you know the race is going to be wet, you can play with things like camber, running less, to have more of the tyre contact patch on the track. With lower cornering speeds, you won't access the camber with load transfer like you would during a dry race, so more grip can be found with a change here. Because lateral grip is so compromised in the wet, cornering speeds will be lower and weight transfer is reduced, resulting in less body roll. This means that your car doesn't need as much roll resistance in the wet, allowing you to run your shock settings and sway bar settings at full soft, assuming that the car is equipped with adjustable dampers and bars. You can even go as far as swapping softer springs into the car if the rain is a certainty. Softer suspension will allow the tyres to stay in more constant and consistent contact with the road, and that's key to maximising whatever little grip is available on a wet surface. Softer suspension settings will also make the car more forgiving to drive. So there you have it. Racing in the rain. Look, it is hard work and it's meant to be. That's how it is in real life. And I think iRacing has done a fantastic job of replicating racing in the rain on the sim. And I can tell you with my 10 years of experience in racing in real life, that during the rain, the conditions are probably just as bad, if not worse, than what have been replicated here on the sim. The greatest key to this in terms of understanding what you like is practicing. So jump into the Rainmaster series, do private practice sessions at tracks that you're coming up to race, and set it for the worst conditions and see how you find it, and learn how to adapt the car and your driving style using these tips and tricks to maximize your lap pace and maximize how comfortable you are running in the wet. If racing in the rain isn't for you, but you're still looking for ways to improve your lap time, or you're new to iRacing and you're looking for some tips and tricks on what you should set up before you enter into your first race, then I'm going to post some links to some videos here and here. Jump into those and have a look. And as always, I appreciate you watching. Please consider subscribing to the channel. And as always, good racing.